Several books with me. Hello, Brittany.
Hi, Bobby.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to talk today about commentator accountability. Now, that phrase may seem a little bit unusual to you, but that is an actual phrase that describes a movement that people have taken for granted in the United States for decades. It's a movement that says words create violence or create suffering, and so we have to hold people accountable when they say things that harm other people. This movement basically led to a lot of what you see in what we call cancel culture, where there is this strong push to keep track of people's statements, whether they're private, whether these are deleted statements, and then to bring them to the public to make people express contrition about having said something. Either they use the N word, or they question the validity of the 2020 election, or they merely don't agree that transgender surgeries are a good idea. Whatever it is, the idea is that you have to keep people accountable. And this is what I've heard from multiple places. People have said, cancel culture is not a real thing. We're just holding people accountable for what they said. Now, this has been taken for granted for decades. There are people that will, I don't meet almost anyone who questions whether this is a good idea. Everyone assumes, yes, it's true that if people make a statement such as, let's say they make a homophobic statement, then they should have to lose their job, because the question is, how can they serve people at their business if they feel this way about one group of people? So the commentator accountability movement gained a lot of traction, and we want to talk about that today. I think it's a failure as a movement. What do you think, Brittany?
Um, well, I think it's a statement on the failure of our ethics system.
Well, I think it's
Somewhat
yeah. Go on.
successful. It's successful in that it gets people fired. It's kind of an extortion racket.
Yeah, well, it is an extortion racket, but it's a failure in that it has not improved anything. It hasn't improved services. It hasn't improved society. It hasn't mitigated discrimination or lowered the rate of suicide. It hasn't done anything. It turns out that spending all of your time and energy policing what other people say is really just a waste of time. And it's not only a waste of time in a neutral sense, it's actually harmful. It's counterproductive for a lot of different reasons. Now,
I think you and I disagree. You take it on its face. I'm much more cynical. I don't think that it's meant to improve society or change things. I think it's meant to harm people and silence them, and it is a mechanism and a cover for power abuses and control. That the people behind this are not interested in improving society. They basically live in a protected society already. Nobody who advocates for this sort of thing is at any kind of risk of anything, whether it's from words or anything else. So I'm more cynical about the motivations behind it. Yeah, they say they're the good guys and they're trying to improve things and keep people safe or whatever, but, to me, when they say safe, I sort of hear, 1930 argument about purity.
Right. Okay, listen. You make a lot of really good points. I want to make a couple quick announcements before we carry the conversation further. One announcement that I would like to make is that you can buy Church and State, How the Left Used the Church to Infiltrate America. That is available at gatekeepersonline.com on the bookstore. I contributed a really great chapter to that volume on what's happening in higher education. And a lot of it relates to this question of commentator accountability and all the people who lose their jobs because somebody goes to great lengths to create a controversy around something that they said. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is that this show, Big Brown Gadfly, has a regular time slot now. You can always catch it live on Thursdays at 7. And that will be on the Periscope TV feed, also the Facebook.com feed and the YouTube feed for Gatekeepers Online. If you go to the website, gatekeepersonline.com, you can usually, or actually you should go to the Twitter feed for Gatekeepers. That's twitter.com/thegkonline. And finally, there's a big event coming up on February 24th, which is a Wednesday, a little bit under 2 weeks. It'll be at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. It will be available through the gatekeepersonline.com and also freedomfirstnetwork.com. This is called Your Diploma or Your Conscience. And this also deals with this cancel culture because Eric Metaxas will be joining us along with John Zamirak, and we're going to talk about the new movement to cancel people's undergraduate degrees. People who went to elite schools are being targeted now as alumni. 20, 30 years after having graduated, they're being threatened with the prospect of having their undergraduate degree revoked because of things that they said that people find objectionable. All right, let's get back to this discussion. Brittany thinks that the commentator accountability movement was always about power, that it was never sincerely about trying to improve society. And I can agree with that. I think that the people who engineered this were essentially propagandists, and they were political strategists, and they were doing this in order to defuse their opposition and to delegitimize dissent and to consolidate control. It's about removing the obstacles to your power. I agree with that. But in order for them to carry the day, they do have to convince the public that there is some ethical basis for commentator accountability. They have to convince the public that somehow by getting somebody fired because of something that they posted on Facebook, that you're improving society, you're protecting the company, you are protecting the consumer, that there's some good that you have carried out and some danger that you have squelched by holding this commentator accountable for what they say. So I do think I can call it a failure because at least the reasons that they give for why they do this have not played out sincerely. They really have not shown themselves to be good reasons. I don't think that, for instance, the suicide rate for LGBT people has been reduced simply because so many people have lost their jobs or been unpublished or barred or blacklisted or no platformed for disagreeing with the LGBT lobby. Would you make any case, Brittany, that the suicide rate for LGBTs went down as a result of this?
Oh, no, of course not. No, I'd never make a case that, any group's suicide rate has gone down. I think all suicide rates have probably gone up.
Right, because ultimately what they do by holding these commentators accountable is they create a sphere where people from these so-called protected communities are really cushioned from a lot of the warnings that they would otherwise be able to get. I think that there is something good to a certain degree about warning people that things that are going on in their community might come around to harm them. And very often those kinds of warnings, so for instance, warning people that the kind of sexual practices that are gaining acceptance in the LGBT community might leave you open to sexually transmitted diseases or might not make you happy. Those kinds of warnings are seen as homophobic because you're criticizing a community that's supposedly protected. But if you completely bar folks from voicing them anywhere and you take away their licensing, you take away their employment, you don't let them speak, you won't host them, you censor them, you kick them off social platforms, then what you've done is you've made it so that people who need to hear that warning it's impossible for them to hear the warning. And so I think it hurts a lot of the people that it's trying to help.
Well, I think that when you can't criticize any subculture for destructive, deceptive, manipulative behaviors, you've created I can't even really sort of think of an analogy other than possibly a cult that has more than one leader.
Well, I think what ends up happening is you do harm the communities you're trying to protect, and it's almost harmed harmful by design, because the idea is that you create a scenario where that community is going to experience harms due to a lack of information, due to a lack of perspective, due to a lack of clear understanding about how the world around them is regarding the things that they're doing. And then the harms that are experienced by that community are then used as a justification for even more commentator accountability. So you blame the people's statements, which are not even available to this community. You blame those statements for the harm that community is experiencing. It's kind of like you create the problem.
You have justification to silence more people.
Right. Yeah. So it's okay. So here's a couple of the problems with commentator accountability, and this is what we're going to be dealing with in that your conscience or your diploma event. Number one, a lot of times these cancel culture campaigns they hinge upon statements that the person either made a long time ago, statements that the person deleted, statements that the person has changed their mind about or recanted, or statements that the person made in private that were not meant for public consumption. So somebody had to...
What about Abigail Schreier? She completely stands by her statements. They're completely correct, and they're all over Twitter saying she should lose her degree from Harvard.
From Yale.
Yale.
Yeah.
I mean, that is not something it's not just things people said at a drunken frat party 25, 30 years ago. It's also research, and things people have said that are true.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
I think it's both problems are part of the larger set of problems, because I think that those are definitely problems with cancel culture. Someone like Abigail Schreier, someone like Paul McHugh at Johns Hopkins, someone like Mark Regnerus, you and me, people who did scholarly work in a field, and they would stand by their results, but they experienced this huge backlash, and they're supposed to be held accountable for hurting people's feelings by telling the truth. That's one problem. Another problem are people who are being held accountable for things that they no longer stand by. I mean, what do we do with those cases? That's another set of problems. Cases where the people holding them accountable actually had to go through an extraordinary amount of detective work to uncover these comments. They had to release private text messages or get a tape recording of something that they said, or find something that's been deleted by using the Wayback Archives. All of those things, that's another brand of problem that I think also deserves mention, because the logic behind the Commentator Accountability Project is that you're preventing harm by stopping someone who might harm people, but all of that is speculative. So a professor who offhandedly used the N-word in a private text message 5 years ago, you're going to go after them because you're presuming that black people are going to be harmed in their community, when the only reason why black people even know about the fact that this person used this word is because you're telling them. So the one who is holding them accountable is actually the one who's causing the harm. You know what I mean? And that to me seems very manipulative. It all boils down to the fact that these campaigns are driven by an agenda, and they're trying to consolidate their power, and it has nothing to do with protecting or helping anyone. And that's why I think it's a total failure. It's really a drag on society.
Well, it's also very intentional. I mean, the chances of somebody's tweet or offhanded comment from, 5-10 years ago causing any harm, part of it is what they want people to do are public acts of contrition. That's what they want, where they can show power and have the person apologize or write, I am sorry for who I harmed. That's even better, because then they get the person to substantiate the narrative that anybody's harmed in the first place.
Right. Even though when you apologize, they don't actually leave you alone. They will continue.
I I have never apologized for anything. I generally stand by what I say.
Mm-hmm.
I have never used the N-word in my life. It wasn't, something that was said in our household, but it would take really an awful lot. I would have to feel that I've done something wrong or wronged somebody to apologize.
Yeah.
I'm not apologizing. I don't apologize in general to the general population because I've done nothing to the general population.
Well, they don't. People who do apologize get killed in the end anyway. So,
it's ridiculous to apologize.
Yeah, because they're never going to say it's enough. So you look at Chick-fil-A, which obviously got attacked because the CEO said something in support of traditional marriage, and within 6 or 7 years later, we've realized that they were working on the side of the LGBTs all along. They were denying grants to the Salvation Army, to companies or groups that were sincerely Christian and just didn't agree with the LGBT movement on this one issue. But even after the Chick-fil-A did all that and apologized and tried to back away from their statements, it didn't matter. They were still trying to block Chick-fil-A from opening up businesses in various cities across the country. I think what's happening is they're trying to impose a neurosis on people, so people are so scared of being caught off guard that they just won't speak at all. And as a result of that, there's a silence. Conversation breaks down. And I think all of this ultimately culminates in what's going on right now in the impeachment trial, where what you find is that people are being held, quote unquote, accountable for just pointing out evidence of election irregularities. I mean, this is how far it's gotten. That, you had an election where the FBI didn't want to investigate all the complaints, all the leads, all the tips. On my Twitter feed, you can see the article that I posted where they kept track of all of the people who observed election fraud, reported it to the FBI, and the FBI refused to interview them, refused to investigate. So there was something that went wrong, even if you want to say, well, we don't know, we can't say one way or the other whether these irregularities actually influenced the outcome of the election. Just bringing those things to light and just representing the people of the United States whom the elected officials are supposed to represent in pointing out truthful concerns, you are being held responsible for murder. And so the obsession with statements has now gotten to the point where they're having a second impeachment trial for a president over things that he has said, and to try to accuse him of sedition and insurrection simply because of statements he made. This is not how a society can function. And if you watch, for instance, some of the statements by the representatives in Congress talking about how they felt so terrified on the day of January 6th, you can see how this neurosis has it's created delusional people in power. Because
that is one, that's one very concerning thing. When you hear these people, who were down the block, essentially, in another building with the hair on fire, I was almost killed. So-and-so wants to murder me. And all of this, you're like, this is a person that is, first of all, representing anybody. They shouldn't be representing anybody until, they're completely medicated and given an all clear from psychiatrists or something. I mean, it's unhinged. They're behaving in an unhinged, hysterical way that should have people very concerned. Whether they're cynically acting out their sort of phony ideology or they truly believe this, I have no idea.
Well, I think partly this commentator accountability movement has always gained strength by arguing that people are harmed by hearing things that they don't agree with. And so as a result of that, one of the delusions is people really exaggerate the harm that has been done to them when they hear things they don't like. So for people in Congress right now, hearing people question the outcome of the election is the equivalent of somebody trying to murder them. They've lost that line. They've lost the perspective and the sense of scale and proportion. What you see happening is that you have elected leaders who are supposed to be strong and stable enough to deal with life and death issues because they're leading the government, and yet they can't deal with it. They deal in a total panic, and they don't understand the gravity of holding power. And this is one of the results of growing up in a culture where everybody is cushioned from hearing criticism, and also from history. They're totally ignorant of history. So they don't understand that when you are in a position of power, the world is always a dangerous place. Political leaders are always in danger because there's so much responsibility on your shoulders. If you just follow the history of any kingdom, any monarchy, the battles over the succession are always intense. And you always have things like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre or a civil war with the War of the Roses, etc. Because you're in power, and there's really no way to guarantee your safety other than to rule wisely and to keep the people's goodwill, right? I mean, how else do you protect yourself?
Lincoln wasn't able to.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that, one of the examples I'd want to close with is the example of David and Mephibosheth in 2 Samuel. David and Saul fight a pretty brutal war with each other, or at least after Saul dies, there's a civil war that ensues between Saul's remaining family and David, and it's a civil war that really tears Israel apart. But as soon as David moves the capital to Jerusalem, he makes a very important gesture, which is he seeks out whoever the remaining survivors of Saul's family are. And David remembers that he was best friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And there is a grandson of Saul named Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth, I'm sorry, I sometimes mispronounce it, who has broken legs. He can't walk because of an accident that happened when he was young. And David not only makes sure that he is fed and cared for, because you can imagine in ancient times, someone who doesn't have the ability to walk might be terribly neglected and just left to die. And he wants to make sure that he's not going to be left to die. But he does more, doesn't he, Brittany? He makes sure that Mephibosheth sits at the king's table and he dines with him every night so that everyone in Israel can see that David is gracious, that he is a bigger man than someone who would be petty, and he's moved on and he's going to rule in the name of even the people who fought against him, right?
Yeah, and you cannot, there's no way for any society to function in a constant state of animosity and disarray. It's not going to function, and David understood that. Right,
yeah. I think it's an important point. Well, Brittany, I really want to thank you for joining us. I wish that we would see examples of that kind of class in our political class. We're not going to see it, I don't think. And I think this commentator accountability movement is a failure. We need someone in a position of leadership to say, I'm not playing this game anymore. I'm just not going to respond to people complaining to me about things that my employees said on Facebook. Somebody's got to be in a position of power to just say, enough. We're not going to do that. That's not the business of my corporation. We're going to go about the business of our work, and we're not going to get dragged into these stupid political battles. I think that there has to be legislation. That's one of the reasons why I am working on a bill that we're drafting at Mass Resistance Texas to deal with cancel culture, to expand the definition of workplace harassment, to make it clear that if you're contacting someone's employer and sharing with that employer statements or writings that are irrelevant to that company's business, and you have no legitimate relationship to that company, and you're doing it...
And if you're harassing that employer and threatening that employer
right.
or company, Also, I mean,
That should be
Amendment
considered.
need-
That should be considered harassment, because harassment is defined as something to annoy or threaten. Yeah.
ultimatums to fire somebody.
Right.
The First Amendment has to be expanded to protect people in their workplace from corporations as well. I think that in a way, some of the things that these lunatics said in Congress may be good, because they're exercising their freedom of speech to completely lie and accuse other people of trying to have them murdered.
Mm-hmm.
That's the government doing it. That is the government. So that may be able to be used in some way as some kind of precedent that stops or puts the brakes on this.
Yeah, well, at any rate, I think that cancel culture and this kind of commentator accountability comes from a culture of revenge. It's an anti-Christian, certainly, movement, because there's no redemption. You can't ever atone for anything. You can never be free of mistakes that you made or statements that may have offended people in the past. There's no way to make amends. I think it's also anti-Jewish in that sense as well, right? Because you have Yom Kippur every year. You're supposed to have a reset. I mean, and this Commentator Accountability Project movement does not have a reset button.
Right, and well, in Judaism, you cannot accuse people of things they haven't actually done.
Yeah.
That's not...
You can't fire someone based on the expectation that they're going to discriminate against someone if they haven't discriminated against anyone.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Right. And so the whole argument that we have to get rid of this person because it's an unhealthy learning or working environment based on something they might do in the future is fundamentally unsound. All right. Well, thank you very much. I am going to have you on again, but I want to sign off. I really want to thank you. It was a great conversation, Brittany.
Okay. Well, try to stay warm there in Texas.
All right. Sure thing. Now, to everyone out there, I want to make sure that you know that on February 24th, 2021 at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, if you go to gatekeepersonline.com or if you go to the Twitter feed for Gatekeepers, twitter.com/thegkonline, you can join us for Your Conscience or Your Diploma. 3 Yale alumni are going to talk about what it means to face the prospect of losing your undergraduate degree decades after having graduated because people didn't like what you said. It's going to be a great discussion. There'll be a lot of interactivity there. Eric Metaxas is going to be one of our lead speakers on it, and I really hope that you guys will join us. Until next week.